case is done, and the next thing I'm going to be doing is moving on to the upper case, the actual desktop assembly, but the desktop itself is going to kind of be last. A lot of this isn't going to be seen. This is all going to be inside the case or underneath the desk. So the only thing you're really going to see here is the front edge of this and whichever piece of this I cut to make one of the sides. So your two sides and the front edge is really all you're going to see of this. There's going to be drawers in here, so you're never going to see the inside. So when I selected the lumber for this, I had that in mind. I grabbed my pieces with knots in them and stuff, and I really didn't worry about that. So this, the next thing I need to do is to go and clean up all of these edges to make sure that they made up to each other well. And the best way to do that, I found, is the method of flipping these over and sandwiching them together like I did on the glue up for the lower case. I'll do the same thing here. So you sandwich them together, run them over the joiner at the same time. The other thing you can do is simply mark what goes against the fence. So this would go against the fence, or the back side of the other one would go against the fence. Some people will mark it facing in, facing out, whatever. The idea is that they're facing the opposite direction when they go across the joint. I tend to just grab them together and run them across at the same time. That way I can make sure that they're kind of exactly lined up with how they were. So that's where I'm going to start. The trick to this technique is how you fold those boards together. I lay them out flat and then fold them in on each other like a book. So what you see in there in the middle between the two boards is actually the top surface of the board. After I've got all the edges straightened out, I'll go and cut some biscuits in. This is purely for alignment, but it really does make a difference. The glue up here is pretty straightforward. I wasn't able to use the panel clamps when I glued this one up. The panel was just a little bit too big, so I saved them for the side piece that I still need to glue up. Here I'm just using parallel clamps. They work just fine. You just have to double check and make sure nothing's warped or popped up. The larger panel is actually long enough that I'm going to be able to get one of the sides of the desktop assembly out of it, but it wasn't long enough that I could get both sides, so I did have to glue up a second panel to make the opposite side. Here I'm using my circular saw to first create a clean and square edge and basically get one side of this cleaned up. I'm also going to cut off the extra material that I'm going to use as one of the assembly sides. With one side of each piece cleaned up, I can now move over to the table saw and cut the other side and cut them to their final width. I'll send the panel through the drum sander a couple passes on each side to get all the glue lines cleaned up and to generally make sure that the whole panel is flat and cleaned up. And with everything cleaned up and cut to size, it's time to start marking out the joinery. So obviously I have a size difference here. This is a very large board to be hand cutting dovetails on, so there are a couple things I'm going to do different, but marking them out is pretty much the same. Doesn't matter if it's a large side of a large case or if it's the side of a drawer. You need to establish the size of the tails, mark your lines, mark your angles, do it with a knife. It's the most precise way you can do it, and then go back and cut them. So just because this is big doesn't mean it's any different. It's the same process, always the same process. The process here is the exact same as I've used on the previous dovetails in this project. I start off by walking a set of dividers down the board to establish the size of the tails, then go back and mark everything out with a knife. Once I've got everything marked with a knife, I'll go back with a white pencil or something visible basically and mark out all the waste. This is just to dummy proof it, for this dummy, so that I don't go and cut on the wrong side of the line. It just makes it a little bit more obvious which side of the line I'm supposed to be cutting on. It's very easy to get lost in what you're doing and end up making a cut in the wrong place. After everything's marked, I'll go back and make all my cuts with my dovetail saw, switch over to the coping saw and cut out the bulk of the waste before finally going and cleaning everything up with a chisel. Setting up to mark this out on such a big board it's the same process, but I did have to make some accommodations for the size of the piece that I'm working on. Normally you can, like with a drawer, you can lay it right out in front of you. I normally work on that end of the workbench, so the first thing I had to do was to turn this 90 degrees and work off of this end. The second concern was my two sides. Because my grain is running vertically, there's a lot of flex in my side pieces. They're not warped per se, there's just a lot of movement in there, so I needed to stabilize them. So what I did is I clamped a piece of extruded aluminum to the back side of it just to make sure that it's firm and stable and it's straight. The other thing with such a big board is making sure that I'm lined up perfectly on these shoulders. So a little aid that I used this time, I have this light that's just whatever you want to call this thing that it's on. It's kind of a flexible mount. I use it a lot of times for illuminating my work, but in this case what I did is I simply ran it underneath, and that allowed me to look down across these shoulders to see where I've got light peeking through and how much, so that I can make sure it's even all the way across. After that, once I'm all set up, process is exactly the same as what you've seen me do before. I'm going to go through, I'm going to mark this out with a knife, and then I will mark all of my waste, bring my lines down to the side, the shoulders on the sides are scribed, and then I cut, fit it up. Let me show you something that just happened. I had a little bit of a setback. I was fitting the sides in, doing my first dry fit of these dovetails, and I was knocking them in. They were a little bit tight, but the sides split on me. So the spot where it split is not one of my previous glue joints. There is a little bit of epoxy here, but that's just because the pith is running down right here, and it was kind of a weak point. So it split right along the grain. I will be able to glue it back together, but it just goes to show, so the direction of this grain was necessary for the joinery. However, having my grain running this way didn't make the strongest board front to back direction, so I'm gonna have to glue that back up before I can do anything else. So a little bit of a setback. I will have to be very careful how I glue it back together, making sure that I'm still lined up on my seam here. But not the end of the world, just a little bit of a setback. With that break in the side fixed and the two side pieces cleaned up and ready to go, the last thing I have to dovetail is two more pieces, and one's from the front of the case in the top and one's from the back of the case in the top. So you've seen this a few times by now and probably know the process. Mark out the lines with a knife, mark the waist with a white pencil to make it obvious so I don't cut on the wrong side. Make my cuts with my dovetail saw, cut out the waist where I can with a coping saw, and then clean everything up with chisels. To make transferring my dovetail marks over to the sides a little bit easier, I did do a quick dry assembly of the upper case just so that I can have the sides exactly where I want them to be. All right, this is a little bit of a relief now. So far, this project has mainly been about dovetails, milling material, gluing up panels, and cutting dovetails. Well, these were the last ones for a while. There will still be a couple more on the drawers when I do those. Those will be dovetailed, but I'm going to step away from it for a little while. There are going to be a couple sliding dovetails as joinery back here, but now I have to build in the rest of the internals of this upper case. And nothing for a while now is going to mean dovetail. So it's been great getting this much practice. It's been great improving them this much, but finally time to step away for a little while. All in all, I'm fairly happy. I think a couple of spots could have been better. Not the worst, certainly not the best. I never expected them to be perfect, but overall I'm pretty happy with them. But anyway, now you can kind of get an idea of what this is going to look like coming together. Obviously, there's going to be legs over there. The spaces in here, this is just a couple pieces of wood stacked up to give it the approximate height, but that's not at all what it's going to look like internally. But the general size and shape, you can get a feel for, and what it's going to be like sitting in it. So far, so good.